Welcome. We're so glad you're here with us for today's Harper Lecture. The Harper Lecture series began in 1979 with Hannah Holborn Gray speaking in San Francisco. As the need for critical thought remains apparent in all areas of life, we proudly continue this signature program to bring you stimulating conversations and fresh ideas. Our UChicago community is a global one, and we are thrilled that technology can help us stay connected to one another. As you enjoy today's lecture, please note the following items. Your camera and video will be off. However, we encourage you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask a question at any time during the talk. Closed captions are available by clicking the box at the bottom of your screen. Click Show Subtitles to enable this feature. If you're having trouble with audio or video, please try shutting down programs in the background, or you can dial in from your phone. Thank you once more for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. Hello, everyone. I'm Andrea Hodgman, Interim Director of Alumni Engagement and the Program Manager for the Harper Lecture Series. On behalf of everyone at the UChicago Alumni Office, thank you for joining us for this important conversation. We continue to watch the ongoing invasion of Ukraine with anguish and sorrow. Our thoughts and sympathies are with those in Ukraine and elsewhere who have been affected by the suffering, violence, and loss of life that the invasion has caused, and we hope for a peaceful end to the conflict. For tonight's program, please allow me to introduce our moderator and our panelists. Robert Pape, our moderator, is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, specializing in international security affairs. His publications include his book, Bombing to Win, Air Power and Coercion in War, and the articles Why Economic Sanctions Do Not Work, and the January 6th Insurrectionists Aren't Who You Think They Are. His commentary on international security policy has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, and Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, as well as on Nightline, ABC News, CBS News, CNN, Fox News, and National Public Radio. Pinar Alakoc is an associate instructional professor in the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. During the 2021 academic year, she was a visiting fellow at the Chicago Project on Security and Threats Research Center. Her research focuses on terrorism, political violence, as well as refugees and migration studies. Her work is published in journals such as Comparative Politics, Terrorism and Political Violence, and Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, among others. Austin Carson is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the politics of secrecy, intelligence, and security in international relations. He is the author of 2 award-winning books on these topics, Secret Wars, Covert Conflict in International Politics, and Secrets and Global Governance, Disclosure Dilemmas and the Challenge of International Cooperation. Paul Poast is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. His research on international relations and quantitative methodology has been funded by the National Science Foundation and has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, International Organization, World Politics, Journal of Conflict Resolution, and Political Analysis, among others. Professors Pape, Alakoc, Carson, and Poast, thank you all for joining us. Professor Pape, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Russia's war against Ukraine is the most dangerous international crisis since the Cold War over 30 years ago, and coming at a time when Americans, American democracy, and the West are already under historical stress from internal pressures. Hence, this crisis involves Ukraine, the possibility of escalation with nuclear powers, consequences for Europe and NATO, and our democracy at home. Tonight, we're going to have a panel discussion and then go to Q&A to talk about these issues. I just want to mention that all of our panelists are affiliated with the University of Chicago Project on Security and Threats, a major center of national and international security at the University of Chicago. To start, we will each make a 5 or 6 minute opening statement, and then we will go to a moderated discussion by me for about 15 or so minutes, and then open it up for questions from our group. And let me start by discussing the situation in Ukraine. like most of us, you probably start your days or most days now looking at this map in the New York Times. This is the most recent map as of about 36 hours ago. And you will see that the red are the stalled Russian advances. And the red has barely moved in terms of territory now for several weeks. The blue is becoming increasingly prominent, and you're seeing now steady defenses here that are making quite a difference. You're also seeing some parts here that are becoming counteroffensives, and those counteroffensives now are reportedly actually winning and taking some ground. As you also know, the invasion involved about 150,000 total Russian troops. As you may not know, there are 245,000 Ukrainian active duty troops, another 200,000 reserves beyond that, and of course, a large civilian resistance. There are several questions I want to address very briefly. The first is, why is the Russian invasion stalled? It's helpful to use Chechnya and Grozny as our most comparable case. This is a case where Russia invaded Chechnya in the 1990s. It took 6 years, but did finally subdue this breakaway republic in the 1990s. As you can see, Chechnya, 1.3 million people, the capital city, Grozny, 400,000 people. The key thing I want you to focus on is the Russian troop to city ratios, population ratios for the city and for the country. This wasn't even a case of steady victory, but in this case, those ratios were 1 to 10 and 1 to 13. Now let's compare that to what's happening in Ukraine, and I think this will help to clarify quite a bit of what's going on. Ukraine, as you all know, 44 million people, 40 times the size of Chechnya, has an army that we have equipped and trained for years, quite a sizable army. So Russian troops versus Kyiv. I'm approximating a little over a third of the force being used against Kyiv. It might not be that large, but still 1 to 50, nowhere near 1 to 10 in terms of ratios. We look at troops to the country, it's 1 to 300. That's really stunning. This would be, in order to get to 1 to 10 or 1 to 13, this would take 4 million troops. Russia doesn't have anywhere near that. Even at its full complement of 800,000 troops, which includes its Navy and Air Force that are ill-equipped for this, this would be possibly a mission like a tenth the size or a quarter of the size. The conventional balance, the Russians are outnumbered even in the direct head-to-head conventional balance. What's the result? Not a Russian victory, a Russian quagmire. And the big question here is this actually heading to defeat? Because if things continue with Russian losses mounting, the minimum estimates by the Pentagon are 10% of the force gone. Just before we came on, it was more than that. The Ukrainians are now successfully counterattacking. The Russians simply don't have the troops. Second question, what are the consequences of economic sanctions? Big area I've studied. The strategy the US and West is using is the same strategy we used against Serbia and Milosevic in the 1990s. It's a double-barreled strategy. We're going to use trade sanctions, and we're basically going to do things to shrink the overall economy. Then we're going to target the cronies. Those are called the oligarchs, and we're going to hit them both at the same time. The economic effects, the ruble is down 40% so far, the Russian stock market unusable for investment, and major disruption. What you may not know is economists are now making predictions. I'm not an economist, but I'll just follow the economist predictions. The Russian GDP will fall 50% this year. That means this is the most severe use of economic sanctions ever. I've studied over 100 cases starting since World War I. The next biggest would be Iraq, which lost 48% of its GDP during that period. Now, sanctions rarely work. I don't think sanctions are likely to coerce Putin, but I do think they will have unintended risks. How can I quickly show you sanctions don't work very well? Iraq, that big case, 48% down, no coercive effect on Saddam Hussein, big unintended consequence with hundreds of thousands of child deaths due to malnutrition. What about Iran? What about Trump's maximum pressure on Iran? Cut GNP in Iran by 8% over multiple years. Now the economy's rebounding, no coercive effects, big unintended consequence with the acceleration of Iran's nuclear program. So I think sanctions are destabilizing Russia. It's a big loss, but it's alongside a military failure. And defeated militaries have their own reasons to rebel. And the Russian Revolution in 1917 was stimulated by the losses on the Eastern Front in World War I. Now, normally, strategic deterrence works by threatening survival of the opponent to deter escalation. But if survival is already threatened, then there's two risks we have to be concerned about. One is the risk of escalation prior to collapse as a desperate effort to change a losing game. This is actually how our oil sanctions on Japan led to Pearl Harbor. There's also the risk of the escalation after the collapse, because if Putin's regime goes down, there's no reason to think it's going to be a smooth handover, given the number of years he's been in power. And as the government loses control, we have to be concerned about a major loose nukes problem. The final question I just want to say something briefly about is Ukraine bringing America together? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And the best contrast is with 9/11. So as you can see, after 9/11, immediately all the parties, all the independents dramatically increased their support for George W. Bush. And then it fell over time. There's only one way to go, it's down. What's happened so far with Biden is we have a split. The same split of polarization we're so used to, that split which helped encourage the January 6th insurrection. And it shows no sign of going away. And the trouble is we're heading toward more sacrifice. So Russia is losing fast in Ukraine. Sanctions are posing risks of unintended escalation. Ukraine is not uniting America. And this could potentially become more of a problem as more sacrifice is required. Our best course is to pursue the status quo ante. Ukraine will likely win. Putin may survive, but that's better than unintended escalation in my book. So with that, let me stop my presentation and let me go to Paul Poast, who's going to talk about the future of NATO, past and future of NATO.
So yes, what I'd like to do is build from those remarks and focus on, if you will, the NATO angle to this. And there's really three parts to the NATO angle. There's what role did NATO play in the lead up to this conflict, and perhaps even saying what role did it play in causing this conflict. That's the first thing that I think is important to talk about. The other part is what role is NATO playing in this conflict? And that's an important angle. I'm not going to say too much about it because it's going to lead into the comments that Professor Carson is going to be talking about regarding the escalation risk. And the third part is, how is this conflict shaping NATO into the future? And that's something that I actually want to start with, because it's something that I think a lot of you in this call could watch tomorrow, because tomorrow NATO is having an emergency, really an unprecedented emergency summit, physical summit. They've already had 3 other meetings since the war broke out, but these were virtual meetings. This is going to be an in-person summit. This is unprecedented, but it shows the extent to which the alliance is taking this crisis seriously, the extent to which they are involved in the crisis, and the extent to which this crisis, this war, has unified the alliance. In some ways, people have said that this war is the ultimate own goal in terms of Putin. And the reason why they're saying that is because if Putin's goal was to undermine NATO by causing this war, it's done the exact opposite. And NATO is perhaps stronger than it's ever been. So that's all that I'll say right now on that side of it. And then in terms of its role during the conflict, Obviously, a big reason why this summit's happening is because NATO is playing a key role in terms of providing weapons, providing supplies, and providing support to Ukraine. Of course, a key part they have not done is provide direct support. And the reason why is something that, again, my colleague, Professor Carson, will be talking about. The main thing I want to focus my remarks on is on that first component, and that is what role did NATO play in terms of causing this war? And this is something that I'm sure many of you may already be familiar with, and that is, of course, the comments and the argument made by our colleague, John Mearsheimer. He's been making this argument for a while, and he's been making it very prominently. In fact, quite recently in The Economist, an essay in The Economist magazine, where he's put forward this argument that NATO, and indeed the West more generally, is to blame for this war. And so what I want to do is, first of all, just briefly, very briefly, say, what is this argument? Identify that there are parts of this argument that I think are worth taking seriously and are valid claims. But then I also want to share why I disagree with this argument and lay out why it is that there's problems to saying that NATO is the cause of this conflict. So the argument is that NATO basically was created as an alliance during the Cold War, at the very beginning of the Cold War, to counter Russia. What that means is that when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1990, and with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO should have collapsed as well. NATO no longer had a function to play, but NATO did not collapse. Instead, NATO persisted and indeed expanded into Eastern Europe, expanded all the way into countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact, which was Russia, the Russian-led or Soviet-led alliance against NATO, moved into those countries, and then finally moved into countries that were actually part of the Soviet Union itself, namely the Baltic states. And from the argument that our colleague John Mearsheimer puts forward is that this was driven by the United States. This was an effort by the United States as part of a, if you will, end of history type moment of pushing institutions, pushing democracy promotion, and to be honest, pushing Russia, taking advantage of the fact that Russia was now weak and the US was seeking to consolidate its gains in Europe by pushing NATO forward. And as our colleague has said many times, is that essentially they were poking the bear. And if you poke the bear enough, eventually that bear is going to become agitated and it's going to strike. And so hence that is the summary of the argument that he's put forward. Now, of course, there's other elements to it, but in a very brief summary, that's the argument. Now, there are components of this argument that I think are very much worth taking seriously. First of all, it is without a doubt that both Russian officials as well as US officials during the 1990s even made comments along these lines that NATO expansion would be perceived as aggressive by Russia. You had Boris Yeltsin making such statements. In fact, going so far as saying the flames of war would go across Europe if NATO expanded eastward. You had President Clinton saying that expanding NATO eastward would be destabilizing. And I think by now, many of you have seen the comments by then Senator Joe Biden talking about how the Baltic states entering NATO would actually be kind of perceived as a red line, though I don't think he used that phrase in the comment, but essentially a red line by Russia. So this was very much perceived, and I think that there is a lot of validity in recognizing that this would not be perceived lightly by Russia. And again, US officials also acknowledge that. But this also leads to, and quite critically, where I think the big shortcoming is in this argument. And that is that the argument as put forward is that it was a US-led effort, that NATO expansion into the East was a US-led effort that was driven by the United States. And that is actually not what happened. NATO expansion was driven by the Eastern European countries themselves. I've studied the Baltic states. I've studied their efforts to try to join NATO. And one of the key things to know about the Baltic states is as soon as they became independent from the Soviet Union, they said, we want to join NATO. And the reason why is because of their history and their perception of aggression on the part of Russia. And they felt that it would only be a matter of time before Russia had the capability to be aggressive again. And they wanted to be able to be part of NATO before that happened. That was also the perception by Poland. That was the perception of officials throughout these Eastern European countries. They drove the process of NATO expansion, which makes sense because, as I shared, US officials also were not eager to expand NATO and definitely were not eager to expand NATO as far as the Baltic states. That's why it's actually appropriate that we're having this lecture today, because the key US official who changed the narrative in the United States to have support for the Baltic states was Madeleine Albright. When she became Secretary of State, she played the key role in saying we need to support the Baltic states. Now, it would still take several years for them to actually join NATO, but it wasn't until she changed the narrative that US officials started to say that maybe we can actually do this. And the reason why wasn't because she was driven by some sort of ideology of democracy promotion. It was because she was listening to the desires and the interests of the Baltic states and how they felt threatened by Russia. And so what this points to is that the ultimate cause of the war is Russia itself, and the fact that Russia has always sought to have influence in this region, whether it's in Ukraine, the Baltic states, or the other countries that are part of what Russia has referred to as the near abroad. And so what you could say is that NATO expansion wasn't a cause of the conflict, but instead it was NATO expansion was driven by fear that such a conflict like this would happen. And now that it has happened, in many ways, it illustrates the value, at least to these states that are part of NATO, of being part of the NATO alliance. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause my remarks. I'm looking forward to answering other questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's terrific. Now we're going to turn to Pinar, who's going to talk about some of the consequences for Europe related to the refugee crisis. Pinar, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Pape, for this invitation. Okay, first of all, I'd like to apologize for my voice. I haven't been feeling very well, but I didn't want to miss this. It's wonderful to be here in such good company. Firstly, I feel for all the people who have been affected by domestic conflicts worldwide and were uprooted from their homes because of someone else's war that wasn't their choice or that wasn't their own making. So many of these conflicts and wars that we have been witnessing over the last decade, right, including the ones in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Syria, they have something in common, which is the forcible displacement of thousands, if not millions, of people from their homes. And what is happening in Ukraine is no exception. This is not just an international security problem, it is actually a human tragedy. So my comments tonight is going to focus on one of the most tragic consequences of the war, namely the refugee crisis. And I'll try to address three questions in particular. What does this crisis look like? What has the response been? And how is this response different from what we observed in the past and why? And based on my own research, what are the possible implications of the current crisis? Okay, what do we expect to see in the future? Now, ever since the conflict began, Russian forces have been deliberately attacking civilian populated areas, shelters, healthcare clinics, including a maternity hospital. So these are horrific attacks, and they have triggered one of the fastest growing refugee crises in the world. According to the most recent statistics by UNHCR, more than 10 million people are now displaced in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about more than 10 million. Just think about it for a second, right? So this means 1 in every 4 Ukrainians is currently displaced. And this is within the first 4 weeks. It just started, so this is unprecedented. About 3.6 million have fled to neighboring countries already, and the rest of the people are internally displaced. So this is what it looks like. How has the international community responded? So far, remarkably well. In fact, many of the neighboring countries have gone out of their ways to help refugees fleeing the war, providing them with humanitarian, logistical, and financial support. Where needed, they introduce emergency procedures so that people can flee without needing to show proper documentation or vaccination certificates. The EU member state activated the Temporary Protection Directive, which will provide refugees with a temporary residence permit in the EU for at least 1 year, right? Which will give them access to employment, to healthcare, to other social services. So it has been excellent. But it's not universally positive. It may also be somewhat surprising because many of these countries that are now welcoming refugees with open arms had in the past taken very tough stances on refugee flows and immigration. Refugees originating from the Middle East, from African countries, they have been depicted as economic burdens, as potential criminals, as cultural threats. I mean, just remember a couple months ago, we have all witnessed the plight of asylum seekers that were stranded on the border between Poland and Belarus. They were mostly coming from Iraq and Afghanistan. So we do see that this unequal treatment and what some call double standard still continue. Ukrainian citizens are given priority to deport the country, but foreigners trying to leave Ukraine to flee to safety have had a very difficult time. But why is this? Actually, part of the reason to this reaction is many of the countries do not see Ukrainian citizens as threats, right? They see them as culturally and socially similar to them. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A. And second, because these countries, by welcoming Ukrainian refugees, are actually sending a strong message to Putin. We stand in solidarity with Ukrainian people against Russian aggression and assaults. So what is likely to come next? First of all, I think what we're seeing right now is just the tip of the iceberg. This war, just like Paul was saying, is not going to end overnight. I mean, I hope it does, but I don't think so, which means that the number of people fleeing Ukraine will continue to increase in the future. And add to this number the thousands of refugees that are already present in European countries because of other ongoing conflicts, we're going to see that this is going to strain their capacity and financial resources, and it may ultimately lead to social tensions and conflict. In my own research, I have seen that, and we were investigating the attitudes towards Syrian refugees in Turkey. Humanitarianism, compassion, willingness to help, these are usually very strong at the beginning of the crisis. But as conflicts drag on, we see that these positive attitudes may deteriorate over time, and they may leave their place to compassion fatigue, to resentment, and even things like common cultural identity, common history, values may not be enough. People may start picking up on subtle differences between in-groups and out-groups. And if conflicts, again, this continues, some Ukrainians may choose to stay in host societies, which means short-term relief responses, emergency measures, this will not be enough. We're going to have to sit down and talk about resettlement, maybe relocation of them across Europe, right? And integration, which takes time, and it also takes, we need shared responsibility and coordination of actions and policies. Now, that said, I would like to end on a high note. Look at this outpouring of support for Ukrainian refugees. This is maybe a positive externality, right? No one else could do what Putin had done in a way. He got a large part of the world united against them. Think about it for a second. This is extremely powerful. If we stay united, we can compel him to stop. And just like that, thank you so much for listening, and I would just leave it to Austin. Thank you.
It was terrific, Pinar, absolutely terrific. And so next we're going to go to Austin.
Okay, good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm going to focus on the question of whether I think Ukraine will remain a limited war. And it's important, before I get into the details, to acknowledge that limited war is a complicated question. We have to ask limited for whom and limited in what ways. And so I'm going to focus on whether the war in Ukraine will remain geographically contained to the political borders of Ukraine versus a regional or even a world war. And I want to acknowledge that this is a US and Western-centric meaning of this question, of defining this question. A limited war for us is not at all a limited war for the families and the innocent lives in Ukraine that are being threatened, terrorized, and even lost on a daily basis. But it is a question that we do want to think about. And so my bottom line is that I'm cautiously optimistic that this will remain limited geographically to Ukraine. And I'll give you three reasons to think about, three reasons that are really drawn from research that I did for my first book, Secret Wars, which was really all about how wars in the modern age remain limited. I looked at the Vietnam War, the Korean War, which were wars the United States was directly involved in, but also the war in Afghanistan, which when the Soviets were occupying Afghanistan in the 1980s, how those wars, which had a very real risk of spreading beyond the political borders, becoming much larger regional, even global wars, how they didn't actually result in that. So 3 reasons. The first one is that in my research, I learned that a lot of the limits in war are actually really hard to see in real time. And yet the threats of an escalated war a nuclear threat that Putin implies, or the possibility of a no-fly zone being imposed. Those are things we can see in real time. And so sometimes it makes it look like the risk of a larger war is much more realistic than if we actually look at it in hindsight and see what those limits were. So some limits on this current war are crystal clear. Biden, before the invasion began, pulled back American personnel and said the US wouldn't intervene. And that's been held to consistently and is one important reason this war has remained limited. But many limits are hard to see. They're implicit and they're based on the behavior of those who are fighting in the war now and those who might join the war if it escalated. They're obscured by the fog of war or even intentional secrecy, as I've looked at in my own work. And so in Ukraine, you can think about questions like, yes, NATO and the United States are supplying weaponry, lethal weaponry, to the Ukrainian government and to the Ukrainian resistance, but what kinds of weapon systems are being provided? Are all kinds that were possible, or are some, like a Patriot missile system, for example, not being sent precisely because it is thought to be a provocation that could widen the war? Who supplies those weapons? How much is being supplied? When a no-fly zone is requested or proposed, is it considered or rejected? Or think about things that we aren't actually able to see very well in real time, like the cyber warfare that's going on right now. There's very little reporting on this. And it's very possible that a range of cyber attacks by the United States, other countries in NATO, Ukraine itself have been underway, are part of the reason perhaps why Russia's having a lot of trouble. But where were those targeted and what was not done with those cyber capabilities? Those are, again, the things that are hard to see in real time. But oftentimes when you sort of look behind the veil and look historically, as I've done, at how leaders understood a war as escalating or being confidently limited, those are the kinds of things that they oftentimes look to. So my bottom line is that historically, restraint is easier to see after the fact. But signs of a possible larger war are very visible and very scary. And so it's just important to keep those in context. My second reason that I'm relatively optimistic about limited war in the way I've defined it is that escalation requires astronomical resources that will put, I think, a brake on this process if it does threaten to widen. So a way of asking yourself a question, if you're sort of thinking about history, is why did the Vietnam War stay limited? Why did the Korean War stay limited in the ways that they did? Well, resource constraints on both sides are a big reason. Major war in modern technology is extremely costly in lives, in equipment, in dollars and cents, and in political costs. In all escalation scenarios, when we think about escalation beyond the borders of Ukraine, they involve Russia projecting military power over long geographic distances in multiple theaters at once. And as Bob's presentation made clear, Russia simply cannot pull this off, in my opinion, right now. They can't take the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. They can't assert air superiority in Ukraine. Their logistics are a huge problem. So for them to widen the war or be drawn into a wider war would simply require a level of resource expenditure that I don't know is even possible or sustainable for very long. The NATO countries on their part are loath for things to escalate for their own reasons. And so on both sides, you have an interest in trying to prevent this war from becoming a regional or global war. And that doesn't guarantee it will, but it is an important reason why it probably will, in my view. The third reason is that escalation is sometimes thought to be or portrayed or implicitly thought of as being automatic or a slippery slope. One action leads to another and suddenly we're in a regional or global war. But I'm not really a fan of that view of how this process works. War to me doesn't take place by accident. And there are miscalculations, but there are steps after those miscalculations that have to fall into place for a war to become wider. And in my own research, I've seen that even a leader like Joseph Stalin in 1950, 1951, is carefully weighing each rung of escalation and seeking ways not to climb too far too fast to keep, in that case, the Korean War limited geographically, even as he was engaging or authorizing North Korean aggression. So even if a local commander involved, say, on the Russian side, escalates in some way, does some kind of cross-border operation into Poland, leaders can reach for new and improvised limits to assert control over that conflict and that possible escalation if they have reason and incentive to do so. I mean, you may not have seen this in the news just this week, but a Russian drone strayed into Polish airspace. And interestingly, the US officially acknowledged or called that an accidental overflight of Polish territory. I have no idea if it was accidental or not. Neither do you, probably. The point is that leaders have the ability to frame incidents to diffuse the escalation of war, that crossing a border with a drone does not kick into force some kind of mechanical process that leads to a World War III with NATO. A bunch of political decisions need to be made before that point is reached. And while human suffering of an unimaginable scale is still possible, there are wild cards. I still think for those three reasons, I'm cautiously optimistic this will remain limited in the way that I've defined that question. Thanks.
That's great. That's great. I think those are all fantastic statements here. I'm going to resist the temptation to go to each and every one and just sort of develop them, because I think they'll come back in the Q&A. What I'd like to do is ask a few questions that I think may generally be on the audience's mind. And this is one that we have spent our lives studying international problems. And so I'm just think they would like to know, what were you surprised at in whatever aspect you were most surprised at in this conflict war situation? Yeah, please, Paul.
Yeah, I'll start off. So I wasn't surprised that there's a war, and I wasn't surprised that Putin decided to invade. I'm on record as saying that he would invade prior to him invading. What I was surprised by was the extent to which he sought the invasion. I thought that he would try for something along the lines of a salami tactic, if you will, meaning just trying to take very small piece of territory, basically as face saving, to say, well, I've amassed all these troops, might as well use them. I don't want to have my bluff called, so I will use them, maybe take part of the eastern provinces or something of that nature, but do something just to an extent to where maybe they acquire a little bit of Ukrainian territory, but not enough to actually spark a full-fledged war. So where I was surprised was the extent to which they sought to accomplish a much wider campaign. And moreover, what surprised me, though in hindsight, I guess makes sense, is they seem to have applied what I've been calling the Crimea model to the entire country. So by what I mean by the Crimean model is back in 2014, Russia took the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine without firing a shot. We call this a fait accompli. They basically sent in their troops, took the territory, sent them on the roads. They didn't even have to go across. It was a very easy operation. And before you knew it, they were there and no one could do anything about it. And they acquired Crimea. My sense is they thought, for whatever reason, that they could do that at scale. And so that's why they used the roads. That's why they didn't use air power at first. They thought they could just go right in and maybe go ahead and pressure Zelensky to leave. But of course, as we know, Zelensky said that he didn't need a ride, he needed ammunition. And I think that that is what changed the game, and then in turn started to change the tactics that are being used by Russia. And that's why I think, Bob, it was good that you brought up about the Chechnya model, because I think that is now what we're starting to see, is they have switched from the Crimean model to the Chechnya model. So I was surprised by the scale at which they did it. And I was surprised that given that scale, they thought they could pull off Crimea for the entire country. But now that they're doing it, well, this is where we are.
And I'll just say briefly, and then I'll go to others for theirs, that I'm with Paul on this, and he and I have talked about this before, which is that it's stunning for a person with this reputation as this cunning, cold, calculating person who's won victory after victory that were limited, for him to go for this big enchilada. He knows what it took to take Chechnya. That's how he became famous and took over the presidency. So this isn't somebody who's like a neophyte or so forth. And this is really going to be a puzzle, folks. And this is going to be going on just like the origins of World War I, just like Japan's attack on the U.S. in World War II, just like Operation Barbarossa. This is going down as another key case that structural realists are going to have a hard time explaining. Anyway, let's go with, please, Pinar. I thought I saw your hand go up.
So, I mean, just like Paul, I was about to say that I found it surprising that some people found it surprising that the war started. Putin, I don't think, is an enigma. He's former KGB. He's very much loyal to his Soviet past, so he didn't necessarily need to be provoked. You can't provoke dictators. This was in planning for a long time, I think. And at least one thing is clear, right? He has been very consistent. He doesn't even consider Ukraine as an independent sovereign country. And every time he makes a statement, he alludes to the intimate connection between the two countries, saying that we're not just neighbors, we're one nation. And just days before the invasion started, probably have seen that, like he had a meeting with the Russian Security Council, like they sit 30 feet away from him, like little toddlers, everything is very staged, and they gave him exactly what he wanted to hear, right? We don't have a border with Ukraine, it's American made. I mean, I think that was Sergei Narishkin, the director of Foreign Intelligence Services, he tried to say a couple words, it was very humiliated. So in that regard, from the annexation of Crimea in 2014 to the most recent recognition of the territorial claims of the self-declared separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine, to the cyber attacks that have been going on even before tanks rolled in, right? Putin has been at war with Ukraine. I mean, what is surprising after the conflict started to me, I mean, I guess maybe not that surprising, is the bravery of Ukrainians who are actually resisting fiercely. They would take their kids and families to safety and then come back to fight. So just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you.
That's great. Austin?
Yeah, let me jump in on the surprise front. So I think a related surprise that I was going to talk about was the colossal intelligence failure on the part of Russia that enabled this large-scale invasion. And I think it's important to think of the threefold perfect storm of mistakes that you need to make to really make this invasion happen the way it did. Number one, you have to have a shoddy understanding of your enemy, that is the Ukrainian political leadership and the Ukrainian military capabilities as they were, the day you crossed that border. Number two, you have to have a shoddy understanding of your own military capabilities and things like logistics and the ability to project power over space and sustain that power projection over time. And number three, you need to grossly misunderstand outside military assistance and what that scale and scope of that outside military assistance will be, given the brazen nature of the invasion that you are planning. And I think those three things were badly misjudged by the Russian military, by Putin himself, and Russian intelligence. Now, why did that happen? I think Pinar was hinting, at the degree to which the crippled, corrupt, and fear-ridden bureaucracy is unlikely to shake Putin and say, listen, that's a terrible idea, look at this, or look at this. One of those threefold mistakes, correct one of them. So it's partly that as a sort of an institutional reason why this happens. But it was very surprising to me that those three very important judgments they had to make in order to plan this and implement this with some chance of success took place. So that's the way I think about it.
I think that's great. And so what I think we should do to the panel here is we're getting close to the quarter to the hour. And so what I want to do is go to some of the questions here that have already piled in, as you might imagine, with the large audience. And maybe there'll be more things that we will have as a little bit of a discussion of some of these questions. Number of people are asking us to comment on, did we do enough in the 90s to work with Russia, democratize Russia, the way we did after World War II with the Marshall Plan in Western Europe? That is, did we make a mistake and not do enough to try to produce democracy in Russia? Maybe Paul Poast, do you think you might want to kick us off on that?
So just a moment here. I had a bit of a technical difficulty, so I missed the beginning of that question.
Oh, let me just say it one more time, because you're of course, our NATO folks. So a number of people are asking, did the US and the West not do enough to democratize Russia in the 90s? And they're comparing it to, say, the Marshall Plan and other efforts to really democratize Western Europe. So are we at fault for not doing enough in the 90s with Russia?
So I think that the big issue with respect to the democratization of Russia and how that may have intersected with NATO expansion at the same time is exactly that these two things were processes going on at the same time. And there was actually, we now know this from looking at some of the documents from the 1990s, that there was a lot of reservations about, could these two things actually happen at the same time? The reason why is because of what I was saying during my opening remarks. There is a very hawkish segment of the Russian foreign policy establishment when it comes to the West. And the reality is that Yeltsin had to very much play to that part. That's why he made his statements about the flames of war in Europe. And the belief was that pushing for NATO expansion would complicate relations between the US and Russia, thereby undermining the ability of Russia to make progress on democratization. Now, as best as we know, there was a bit of a perception on the part of Bill Clinton that he could thread that needle, that he could both push for NATO expansion into, in the case of the 90s, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, and at the same time, be able to move Russia towards democracy. And part of that was because he had a great personal relationship with Yeltsin. And we now know this from various documents. They were almost like really good. They were great friends. People refer to it as like the Boris Bill relationship. And so he thought that that personal relationship he had could help thread that needle. In many ways, it echoes a lot of what we would hear Trump talk about. Well, he's going to have this great relationship that's going to allow him to pull this off. So ultimately, I think that that was a miscalculation, thinking that these two things could go in the same time. Now, having said that, if you had to choose one process over the other, you had to choose either NATO expansion or helping Russia democratize. I think given what I was saying about the desires of the Eastern European countries, they probably made the right choice by favoring NATO expansion over democratization. But to my view, that was one of the big things that really undermined that process.
And of course, the Soviet threat after World War II to Western Europe facilitated a lot of the Marshall Plan-like dynamics, which is not really a situation you could truly flip, as you're saying, Paul. So I think that's great. Did anybody else want to, because we do have a lot of other questions. So let me go to another one we have a bunch on, which is, folks really want us to say, is Putin going to use attack nuke or not? Put probability statement on that. I think I would widen this out a little bit. And I would just say that what I'm saying in my talk on the question of nuclear weapons is the risks of nuclear escalation are going up. Now, how might that actually occur with a tactical nuclear weapon? I think it's unlikely, of course, never impossible, that a tactical nuclear weapon would be used in Ukraine itself. And why do I say that? It's because we have studied the United States and Russia and also other nuclear powers for decades about how to use nuclear weapons in battlefield environments. And we don't have good answers to this. And this is true at the levels of classified documents now coming out. And why? Because there's radiation blowback. There's yield blowback. Think about this as not just 1,000 times worse than Chernobyl inside of Ukraine, but 10,000 times worse. And of course, it's a function of the actual yield. So a battlefield use of tactical nuclear weapons, I think, is not the most likely in the way I'm describing the risks going up. Much more important, I think, is to think about nuclear weapons as causing fear. And their fear, what it means is the first use as a signal to greater use and more threatening use. So a key scenario would be the first use by Putin might be in a desolate part of Russia where there's no people. It could even be called a test. That would be a very scary signal right now if that were to occur. Another slightly higher up would be detonating a nuclear weapon in space above Russia, in Russia's space, knocking out commercial satellites and causing havoc in our economies. That would be a tremendous issue that for decades, we have worried about this with the first Soviets and now Russia. So our Space Command, I taught for the Air Force for a while. This is a major issue. And the problem is our satellites are just so vulnerable. Not necessarily our military satellites, but the commercial satellites that drive the economy. Very, and that would be another very scary thing. I would just suggest that we don't think about it, that even though Putin, I would say it's still unlikely that this will happen. I'm not saying it's more likely than not, but I do think that if it were to happen, the pathway would be Putin using it as a political weapon to push us back. And these are going to be much more difficult to deal with if they're exploded over his own territory. So I don't know if others would like to come in on that. Yeah, please, Austin.
Yeah, sure.
Disagree too, if you want.
Yeah, I probably do. I think it's very tricky to talk about this because there are definitely scenarios that we could sketch where it's potentially useful to do something like this. My personal view is that, whether Putin is, perfectly rational or starting to wander away from it, I feel like there is, one thing I can count on with Putin is which is he wants to stay in power, and he wants to survive politically. And I just can't think of personally, I don't see a reason why using a nuclear weapon in a variety of tactical scenarios, or some of these other ones that you just mentioned, Bob, are really going to ultimately appeal to Putin. And so I have a relatively, again, optimistic view about the fact that I don't think this is very likely. It's certainly more likely than it was before the Ukraine invasion. But if we're moving from, a 0.1% to a 0.5% chance, sometimes I worry public discourse about this and the sort of very real and understandable fear of the use of nuclear weapons sort of overshadows its real probability. The other thing I just think is really important for our audience and all of us to keep in mind is the difference between a single nuclear detonation and an actual strategic nuclear exchange of some kind. And I think that there are many reasons to believe that if Putin, for some reason, positions his brain in a way that using nuclear weapons in Ukraine for a coercive purpose or for an actual battlefield purpose makes sense, that there is a lot of geographic and qualitative differences between that and a nuclear exchange between the United States or another ally and Russia. And there would be incredible political pressure to isolate and turn Russia even further into a pariah if they initiated the use of nuclear weapons for the first time since the United States used them to end World War II. And I don't think I see a credible scenario for that to turn into an exchange in terms of each other's homelands using strategic weapons. I think there's
no, and I wouldn't go that far either.
I know you didn't say that, but I want to make sure that our audience
that's going quite far. But and all I would say is this is healthy for them to hear some disagreement, even though it might appear the disagreement's a little bigger than it probably actually is, because going from 0.1 to 0.5 to maybe 10%, that level of probability, but that's helpful, I think, for the audience to get a sense of this. Pinar?
So I was going to say, there's this deliberate and ongoing disinformation and misinformation. And just weeks ago, they were talking about, Russia was claiming that US is running these biolabs in Ukraine. And I was thinking, oh my God, are they trying to just build a foundation to justify a forthcoming, because some people also thought so. But then looking at it, yes, Putin is threatening a nuclear war, right? He has ordered the strategic nuclear forces to be placed on high alert. But I think he's just, escalating the conflict to de-escalate, to basically signal that, the West should be deterred, NATO members should not get involved. So he's trying to send that message, because I think he very well knows, just like Austin was saying, that in case of even though it is tactical, those at the receiving end of this, they're not going to be able to say, oh, we were attacked by tactical ones, not strategic ones. Thank God. They're not going to make that distinction, right? It's going to be reversible, and it's going to bring him down as well. So I don't think, even though he's capable of doing that, I don't think he's willing to do that.
Okay. So let's go to another question that's coming in. A lot of people have questions about China in one way or another. And maybe a good way to ask it is, do people think the war in Ukraine is going to make China, possibly Iran or other countries, more aggressive? Yeah, please, Paul.
Yeah, so in terms of being more aggressive, it's hard to say. But I think what's very clear is that this war does have implications for how China will look at its own territorial disputes, because it has a number of them, how Iran could be looking at its nuclear program. I think that it would be naive for us to think that they don't. However, I think one thing that I've been thinking about is we really have to reverse the causality here. So a lot of people have been saying that, oh, this war could lead China to think differently about its policies. But actually, China for the past 2 years has been already been aggressive towards its neighbors with respect to territory. It has, of course, taken the policies it has vis-a-vis Hong Kong. It started a renewed conflict with India in the Himalayas. It has made more overtures towards trying to take over Taiwan. It has escalated its dispute in the South China Sea vis-a-vis Japan. These have all been things that have been happening in the past 2 years, which a lot of people, such as our colleague Dali Yang, who studies China, would say are almost kind of a diversionary tactic because of how much China took in terms of not even just internationally, but criticism domestically because of its handling of COVID-19. That a lot of people think that a lot of these policies were pursued by China's government to try to distract from those shortcomings. And so, if anything, you could almost look at what Putin's been doing and what Putin is now done with Ukraine as just another one of these incidents of a country that has a revisionist aim starting to take measures to actualize those aims. Now, China has not yet gone to the point of fully trying to conquer one of these. But as I think I and my colleagues already shared, we were surprised that Putin has already gone this far. I would have expected Putin to pursue something more along the lines of what China has done with respect to India. But that is where, so I think China has taken a lesson from this, that yes, that is why we haven't gone that far yet, because of exactly what Putin is witnessing. But I think that nevertheless, you can look at what's happening in Russia as part of a pattern of both China and Russia pursuing more revisionist aims with respect to their territorial disputes that they have.
So please, Austin.
Yeah, I have a different take. I think I'd be shocked if any other government looks at what's happening in Ukraine right now and says, you know what, territorial conquest pays. I think that one of the silver linings in this tragedy is that even though this was the most brazen violation of territorial integrity in decades, the response to it, both by the international community and the fact that Russia will probably lose this war, or at least have something of a quagmire that did not achieve its objectives, it teaches an important lesson. And while Paul, I think, suggests us sort of thinking about this as a sort of similar trend, I think it's actually a sort of category difference. That what Russia did was, unlike the little green men in eastern Ukraine or what happened in Crimea, unlike building islands in the South China Sea, if you're China, they just rolled tanks across the border and tried to take over a country. And when you don't have an excuse for that, and it is a naked and brazen invasion of a country, what we see is that's actually quite different than what the sort of like nibbling away gray zone type of tactics to alter the territorial status quo that other states might engage in. What Iran might do in a shadow war that it's involved in with Israel in the Middle East. These are things that are all below the level of an overt invasion. And that's what Russia did. And now you see where it's found itself. And so I actually have a very positive take that I think China would learn from this. We are not going to overtake Taiwan in anything like the Russia scenario, because we see what can happen. And so maybe that doesn't mean they don't, change their mind about what to do in Taiwan. Maybe they go about it a different way. But I think there's an important lesson in a sort of cautionary lesson for anybody who wants to try something like this, in my view.
So let me just add something that's sort of in between the middle. So the way I think about this is, I believe states want power, and I believe they really want primacy. If you look at 1992, the share of world product, the United States had the most at 20%, China was 4%, and Russia 5% in 1992. That's 2 years after the end of the Cold War. By 2021, the United States has fallen to 16%. We've lost 20% of that great economic pie that is the heart of our power. China has risen to 19%. They've actually overtaken us. Russia has fallen to 3%. Of those three, who's the one country that has not fought a war to conquer a country? It's China. And I think China would know, and I've been there many times, I've been to Taiwan. I think China would know that taking on Taiwan, very, very big problem, much bigger than Ukraine. And I think they like their primacy. For them to do this, and with the risk that they would lose a third of their GNP through their trade, man, think what's just happened to Russia, 50% GNP loss, and this is going to get worse over time. Next, I want to ask a question about the no-fly zone here, and is given the remarks we just had on how unlikely we think nuclear escalation is, somebody's asking, well, does that mean we can do the no-fly zone? Yeah, Paul Poast?
Well, before I answer that, I'd actually, because one argument I've heard, I'd really like to hear what Pinar has to say about this, is I've heard a lot of cases for kind of maybe not a no-fly zone from a military standpoint, but a humanitarian no-fly zone because of these refugees. So I'd very much like to hear Pinar's views on that possibility.
I mean, well, to me, I think the reason that United States is arguing that we should not have a no-fly zone is because they may have to shoot down Russian planes, and then, you know, it may actually bring both sides together, and they're just being very firm that we're only taking defensive posture. We're not going to be actively involved in this war. They made it very clear, right? So that's the reason why they're against no-fly zone. But you're right, we should have humanitarian corridors. So that, to me, I mean, it's important so that people fly to safety, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know if they're going to be actually, even if we have a no-fly zone, will they actually respect it is another issue that I keep thinking.
Great. Please, Austin.
Yeah, I'll address that. The original question, if nuclear war is unlikely, or if nuclear use is unlikely, does that mean we should do a no-fly zone? And my answer is absolutely not, so, to put it bluntly. And that's because a non-nuclear conventional war, even just an air war, directly between NATO and Russia would be involve an incredible loss of life and an incredible amount of resources. And even if it never escalates to the nuclear level, it would be an epoch-defining military conflict. And maybe it could be controlled and limited. Maybe it would only be in Ukraine, and it would only be in the air, but it would still be a tremendously costly and dangerous scenario. So in my view, the rejection of the no-fly zone is not simply because of the risk of this becoming the worst possible nightmare scenario, but because of many other nightmare scenarios that would develop if this became a direct hot war between the US or NATO and Russia.
Please, Paul Poast.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I think what's really important to keep in mind about a no-fly zone is indeed this idea that you have to enforce it. And the best way to think about this is to go back to a war that the US had when the US invaded Iraq. And there's a tendency on the part of people to view the 2003 Iraq war as suddenly coming out of nowhere, that it was like suddenly the US decided we are going to invade Iraq. And instead, it was an escalation of an existing policy. Of course, the US had fought the first Gulf War. Following the first Gulf War for a decade, the US and the British, the two main countries that invaded Iraq, were maintaining no-fly zones over Iraq. And a lot of pilots, and I'm sure, Bob, you could probably talk to this, a lot of pilots would talk about how you could, if you wanted to gain combat experience, one of the ways to do that was to be assigned to the no-fly zones over Iraq, because they were actual combat zones. So it's important to recognize that the Iraq War was an escalation of a conflict that had already been ongoing, which was the US and the British maintaining these no-fly zones. To me, that points to what it means to have a no-fly zone. It is a form of combat, and that is why it carries so much risk.
So a lot of times when people think of the no-fly zone, they think of the no-fly zone over Iraq. What's important to know is that Iraq had no capability to hit anything above 15,000 feet. So we flew what's called CAP, Combat Air Patrol, above that and had no risk whatsoever to our pilots. Not a single pilot's life was lost in years of those missions. This would be a different story, ladies and gentlemen, because Russia has plenty of SA-300 and other surface-to-air missiles, which are air defense missiles, that are long enough range to be shot from Russian territory to shoot down F-16s, F-15s, F-18s, maybe even F-22s from a certain angle, because F-22s are only stealthy from certain angles, not every angle. So as we go forward here, this is what I think our military is really concerned about, because once you get our aircraft in the sky and once our guys and gals start getting shot down, that's going to create a lot of pressure to attack the things shooting them down. You see what I mean? And those are those surface-to-air missiles that are going to be on Russian territory. And so that's the scenario I think that we're really concerned about here in terms of this. And then for me, because I am a bit more concerned about that risk of escalation as Putin is losing the war here, that is that concern about the dust up there. But let me ask another question that's coming in, which is, the timing by the year of Putin's, do any of us have any insight as to why this year with Putin? Why not a couple years before, couple years later? Some people may wonder about relations with Trump in this regard, but whether it's about US domestic issues or not, just do we have any insight about the exact year of the invasion? Yes, please, Paul. Yep. Or Pinar.
Looked like you were going to jump in.
Yeah, Pinar. Yeah.
Okay, I will jump in. So I think that sometimes, and this is really unsatisfying, sometimes things just happen, right? That a lot of times we try to say that, oh, this exact timing is present. So for example, here you've heard a lot of people say that, well, Putin must have been emboldened by the way that the Afghanistan withdrawal happened, right? That they say that was so disorganized that just shows the US is not going to be willing. We're showing a lack of commitment. The problem is that there's actually the opposite argument that can be made, which is that, no, the whole reason why we got out of Afghanistan was so that we could commit more resources to Europe, to East Asia. And so it's really hard to say which of those arguments really applies. The reality is that there has been an ongoing conflict in Ukraine since 2014. We took Crimea, there has been fighting going on there, and there have been buildups at times before. There was a buildup early last year, and then he started a buildup again late in 2021. This time, he decided to actually go for it. So I don't know if we can say that it was because he got any type of green light from Trump, or if it was because of the Afghanistan withdrawal. I think he just, for whatever reason, we probably won't know for a long time what exactly that reason was. He felt like now was the time to escalate things. Again, if you want to draw the analogy, you could say same thing with George W. Bush back. Why 2003? Why didn't he do it in 2002? Why didn't he wait till 2004? But the reality is we had an ongoing low-level conflict with Iraq, and Bush decided that that was the time to start to escalate it. And it's really hard to say that there was anything magical about March or the spring of 2003. And I think it's the same thing here. It's hard to say there was something magical about this moment that led to it.
One thing I would say, just as a general point from having studied many, many cases of intervention over time, is that we often learn many years later about a key element we can learn nothing about in real time, and even our intel community knows very little about, which is the true internal domestic political pressures on the leader and the government. Those issues, we of course have a CIA to try to get at that, but getting at that is another story. And this is one of the huge black holes right now, which I don't think our government has a good sense of, or else they wouldn't constantly be predicting Ukraine's collapse any minute. I think that this is something that unfortunately is just the problem with waiting until we can really understand something more internal. Now, before we've only got five. Oh, please, Pinar, you go right ahead.
No, just very briefly, I was going to say Gary Kasparov just said something that resonates with me. He said, when it comes to dictators, the question is not whether or not are they going to do it. It's just a matter of time. So as I said, this was like coming. It was in the making. It was simmering behind the background, right? Again, maybe the refugee crisis, actually, at the time, America said, this is just, again, something staged, so that we don't pay attention to the military developments that's happening, the military developments of Russia against Ukraine. So yeah, I guess we will be clear, as you guys were saying, we're going to have more ideas to why now, a little later.
So with our last couple of minutes, let's address an issue that is also coming up quite a bit. What's our sense of the ultimate outcome that we're likely to see in this conflict? And that could include off-ramps that Putin might take advantage of. That could include, the outcome in Ukraine. So it doesn't have to be, you can pick the part of it you would like to talk about as the ultimate here. I think, did I see Austin first? Yes.
Yeah,
Austin?
I'll wade into this very tricky issue. I think, as I think most of us have thought about or read about, that the key to finding a way out of this is for, at least at this stage, some sort of face-saving, in my view, way for Putin to be able to withdraw military forces and point to some gain beyond what he had in the status quo the day before the invasion, which at the same time is compatible or sellable or marketable for Zelensky on the Ukrainian side. And the real trick is that that neutrality seems to be for Ukraine, or a commitment not to join NATO, alteration of the constitution along those lines, seems to be one piece of that, which would be, I think, in my own contribution to this would be, I do think there's a way in which Zelensky and Ukraine could sort of view that as a patriotic self-determination. We will not be part of one side or the other. This is us. Ukrainians will defend Ukraine and be Ukraine. There has like sort of a consistency there between the level of nationalism within Ukraine, what Zelensky could sell to his people at this point, and what Putin wants. The problem to me, and the thing I still can't figure out, is what happens with Crimea and with the eastern provinces of Ukraine, because it seems to me like either those are in Russian hands or they're in Ukrainian hands, and there's kind of, it's not acceptable to one or the other side depending on that. So maybe there's some way of getting around this. Diplomatic agreements are the history of them is replete with linguistic solipsisms and strange terminology to get by some of these tricky issues. Maybe Crimea is not acknowledged, but is somehow implicitly recognized as being in Russian hands, and that gets, that's sellable inside Ukraine and gets them out of that. So some kind of negotiated deal, hopefully in the coming months, as Russia's operations grind to a halt, or perhaps even regress, would be the optimistic scenario, and one that I'm hoping materializes.
Let's see, Paul, would you like to jump in on this? Or Pinar, would you like to jump in?
I was going to say, I do realize that political scientists are generally very bad at making predictions, but I think Putin is going to lose this war. I dearly hope so, because I think what he wants is a Ukraine without Ukrainians, which is not going to happen. So he's going to be compelled to stop. But at the same time, I was thinking about the potential consequences for the rest of the world, right? I think we're going to have a global food crisis because Russia, Ukraine, they do control and they do export grain, corn, barley, right? So there'll be that. European countries are doing everything they can to reduce their dependency on Russian gas, natural gas and oil, but these things take time. Refugee crisis will escalate, as I said before. And, orphan children, women, they are, unless protections are in place, they are very open to being exploited by human trafficking rings, right? So from one type of victimhood to another. And finally, the crisis will worsen the global pandemic, I think, because when you're trying to flee a war, you don't necessarily think about sanitation or how to properly wear a mask. So in short, Putin may lose, but I'm not sure if the world is going to win either. So
great. Yeah, please, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, your comment reminds me of the famous quote from Kenneth Waltz, which is asking who won a war is like asking who won the San Francisco earthquake, right? That it's like, it's a horrible event and everyone loses from it. In terms of how this war could go, I think we're heading towards a quagmire for Russia. And the reason why is because I can't see right now a face-saving way for Putin to be able to say, you know what, I messed up. We had bad intelligence, all the things that Austin talked about. Yep, those were all wrong, and therefore we're going to stop. I don't see that happening. I think because they didn't achieve their primary objective, they're going to go all in on this Chechnya model, which, as the presentation at the beginning pointed out, could go for years. And I think that they would be quite content to allow this fighting to go on for quite a bit of time. Now, one thing that might lead to that to not be able to happen is if they economically can't afford to keep this going. But that's the other thing that I have a lot of concern about is these sanctions are unprecedented. The scale, the scope, but it requires keeping a coalition together. And if there's one thing that we know as international relations scholars is cooperation is difficult. And maintaining a coalition of countries to keep these sanctions on, sure, for 4 weeks, they can do it. For 4 months, okay, you're going to start to see someone starting to fray. To go beyond that, 8 months, I think you're going to start to see countries start to defect from that. And the reason why is because of a need for some of these resources that Russia has. And so that would be the thing that could enable Russia to be able to continue going. And I think that Putin might be aware of that time may actually be on his side with respect to this economic pressure. So that's why I think that my concern is that this could become a long-term, low-level stalemate in Ukraine.
So I think, Paul, that's great. The one country I don't think will defect is Ukraine itself. So I think that's a big deal because we keep, I think, thinking of Ukraine as Chechnya or Syria after it had been beaten up, or Georgia, 7 million people. This is 44 million people. And yes, many have left, and yes, many are displaced, but those folks are incredibly angry. We think the West is angry. These folks have to be 10 times more angry at what they've just lost as a result of this. And I think that what that is that's really the problem for Putin. The fundamental problem for Putin is not America, and it's not the West, it's Ukraine. And 40 million Ukrainians have been tying him in knots and his forces in knots already for a month. I don't think they're going to somehow give up on that over time. And I think that means that very likely this will end, may take a while, the way all nuclear crises have ended. Literally, folks, every nuclear crisis since 1945 has ended with the status quo. We've never had a nuclear crisis, whether it's with the Cuban Missile Crisis, US or Soviet, whether it's India, Pakistan, whether it's involved in Israel in the 1973 war. They've never changed the status quo. Now, maybe this will be the first, but I think there's a lot of reasons why the status quo is powerful in a nuclear crisis, and this time even more so because of the power of the Ukraine people themselves. They, I think, are winning this war. And I think that's very important. But I think this has been a tremendous panel. I think at this point, though, we need to turn it over back. We're a few minutes over to Andrea. And I'm sorry we have to do that because I've learned so much from my colleagues in this panel. So just thank you all.
Yes, thank you all so much, Professor Pape, Alakoc, Carson, and Poast for your time tonight, for sharing your knowledge. I learned a lot too. And thank you to our audience for your terrific questions, and apologies that we couldn't get to them all. So thank you again. Good night and take good care.